Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of The Intelligent Community, the podcast of the Intelligent Community Movement. I'm Zacharilla, one of the founders of the Intelligent Community Forum. This podcast is brought to you by the members of ICF. To learn more about how your city or company can become a member of the world's tightest network of communities that are prepared successfully and together for the digital age, visit intelligentcommunity.org/members. Well, today we begin part 2 of our conversation with author John G. Jung. If you haven't heard part 1, we encourage you to go back and listen to that one because John talks about his young life, which is reflected in his work of fiction, Black Rock. Today we move it forward a little bit and talk about some of the influences that have led to building better cities around the world. So without further ado, I'm going to take you to that conversation. This is part 2 of my conversation with my colleague and fellow co-founder, John Jung. We take it for granted now that the telecommunications industry, that the real estate industry, the economic development industry, the planning industry, the local governments, that, oh, sure, they're always together at conferences. They always talk. It was the first time. I mean, a lot of them didn't know the satellite people were there. They didn't know why they were in the room with these other people. But, right?
That's true. That's true.
That's probably, but by the time we had got through with that, people were beginning to see the connections. And the other thing, just for the audience's sake, John, when we say teleports, we don't mean the things like Star Trek, the beaming people up and, moving their bodies from Chicago to, to Mars. What we're talking about is within the context of trade and World Trade Centers, information ports. The idea you guys had on that board was, and we were managing the organization at the time, Robert and I, was that we had trade ports, we had airports, and these were all run, right? And we had real estate developments, World Trade Centers, but now we had information ports. That was the new evolution. And that was sort of where the digital age we felt and the internet and some of these things that people weren't really familiar with were bringing us. And that those things would feed into the type of place that would transform communities to the extent, John, where a lot of the work that you've done is, if I may, just sort of taking the Black Rocks of the world, the no-name communities, the communities that have struggled in the industrial age, all of these places that kind of eventually fell on hard times and giving them a new birth, a new life, right? And that was where this whole thing kind of shifted for you and us. We saw it as, we're in a tough situation here economically. Cities have collapsed. The rural sectors have collapsed in many places. But now we've got this idea, and it can go out there and it can burn like a fire. And sure enough, things have connected. Again, just to go back to the book, do you want to speak to that? Is any of that sort of inferred in Lucas's experience in that book? Did he ever see something like that?
No. So Lucas, this is a 4-year-old boy who kind of through this story, goes to the first couple of years of his high school. He doesn't see that kind of future moving forward. But in some of the other books that I've written,
I was just thinking
it does. I mean, when you talked earlier about places like Espoo, in Eden 2084, where we look at what the future might be like, Espoo becomes the model community. And places like Eindhoven and LaGrange, these are all communities in other books where they've been able to turn around because they've discovered that this information portal has more to do with the creation of community jobs of the future, the creation and the attraction and retention of talent in their communities, and the ability for the communication capabilities to actually be the catalyst around which that community can either evolve or to regenerate itself in a particular way. I try to pull that out in those other books. In Black Rock, BlackRock stayed very much the way it still
Yeah,
is. When I
yeah,
drive through there today, I shake my head saying, what happened to that community? I mean, it's Buffalo, and other parts of Buffalo did regenerate itself and get a lot better. It's waterfront and other places like that. But something happened that BlackRock didn't have that opportunity. That's not to say that it can't at some point,
right.
and so maybe the hope in the long term is for that community to be able to turn itself around. Where the story turns around to create to demonstrate the empathy of the community is really in how um, these white people help to rebuild the homes of the black folks that lived on Grace Street that were burned down by white terrorists, basically.
Yeah.
And so it was more about hope that way and the empathy of that community on the racial side of things than it was about, economic development and the opportunities for that community to grow.
Yeah, and there's something about that part of the story that again is universal, that people in communities will help each other out at the end of the day. The community is, we always talk about democracy being the last best hope. Well, it is, but we think communities are the last best hope, right? Because if they stay intact, then everything else begins to flourish. And people will do things like that in community. There is that ethos. There is that human spirit that will look at something that is so wrong that they will try to right it, even if they don't have the power to do it. And you seem to have experienced a lot of that because, again, you were fundamentally powerless coming over to this country, right?
And a lot of immigrants are still today as they came over from the wars in Afghanistan or the troubles in Syria and so forth. I see them in the neighborhoods that are near where I live now, and but I do see that they're evolving, that they've arrived, found jobs, move out of the sort of squalor, that's in those apartments that they sometimes all live together in, and they find new homes.
Yeah.
And it's not a lot of years before they're part of that community
Yeah.
and thriving. I'm seeing a lot of immigration in Canada, at least, that's very successful, very
Mm-hmm.
successful.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about, where things have come in terms of the movement since 1995, maybe take a little snapshot of what we saw in Dublin and give some perspective there. But I do want to stay on that point because uh, there is the belief that we can continue to have these experiences where people like your character and like yourself and like me, I'm first in family to go to university, can have these experiences and continue to push forward and pull the societies with them forward. Do you think that is threatened in any way today? Has the channel, the path upward, been made more difficult? Because that's the thing we work on all the time, right?
Yeah. And I've taken it to an extreme in my first book, Eden 2084, where I talk about red and blue states and
Yeah, you do. It's
you
Civil War
know
there.
the
Yeah.
the, the fact that there's a civil war in the United States come 2040, and
Right.
what happens after that to get to 2084. But no, I think there's something in people's hearts and souls where they do in fact want to do better and to do better with their families and their other the other people in their community, but also for their country, um, and for the world. I mean, look at how everybody has reached out to the Ukraine.
Hmm.
How many people have been to the Ukraine or even know Ukrainians? There's so many people who have given so much to help them in Ukraine to succeed. But looking at the story, if you look at how the community comes together to help the families on Grace Street, I think that is very much what people are experiencing in North America, particularly, to help each other and make sure that they're able to survive. They may have differences of politics, but at the end of the day, I think they do come forward to try and help their community to survive and thrive.
Yeah, I think so too, John. I always say people can be pretty stupid, but they're not suicidal. And at the end of the day, like everything else in nature, we seek a balance. But I think we have to have organizations like ours and others moving people toward balance, or letting them see that balance does exist so that they don't stay mired in this current era of contempt and anger, right? And again, I think a voice like yours, an experience like yours has helped continue to help people sober up and say, look, there's middle ground here. There's always hope. You can always balance out. And I think that's really important in this era that we're in now. I have to ask you, your mother and father are almost heroic figures in this book, or the
Yeah.
character, the mother and the father,
Yeah.
Vati and Muti. Do I have that right?
Well,
Yeah.
Vati, in German, Vater, Vater, but kids usually call their Vaters Vati.
Vati.
And Mutti is the name of that children usually give their mothers in German. Yeah.
Your mother and father, uh, Vati and Muti, and I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. They seem to be heroic in this book. I really developed a respect for them. I didn't know your parents, of course, but they seem to be pretty seminal figures in your development. Did I have that right?
Yeah. My father died when I was 12.
Hmm.
And I mean, he had a rough life, somewhat covered in the fictionalized nature of the person I call Fati in the book, but very similar. I mean, he went through the war and was sick as a result, and died from it. So that some of those things were true. Um, how they acted around responding to the kind of challenges that were in that community
Right.
is what I recall. You know, um, in fact, it's reflected in the brothers and the sister as well, on how you react to how the bullies treated you, and how you got beat up, and how they tried to protect Angie's little kids store from
Right.
being robbed and things like that. I mean, it was amazing the kind of theft and destruction that was going on around you, and how you've either got involved or didn't get involved, and they kind of guided me through that. Now there were times when they didn't understand. I mean, my mother was not able to understand because she didn't quite capture the language at the time. She lived in a Germanic community that reflected, herself, basically, her language, her culture. She worked outside of the community, so she did get to experience some of that, but she didn't understand how things were changing. But she grounded me in the fact that we had a family, and that we, existed as a family, and we needed to
Yeah.
protect our family as a result, uh, from that point of view.
Yeah. But again, so just as you say, difficult lives, but they understood, where you needed to go, and I think in a lot of ways we're just there as a support to keep pushing. I mean, that's the same experience, right? I mean, I had my grandparents were from Italy. My grandmother, my father's mother, never spoke a word of English, so we had to communicate with her. And but they were insistent that we do well, and they sacrificed an awful lot for that. And again, people don't realize the history of our countries. No one likes somebody coming from someplace else and being a threat, right? Today you hear the crazies say the Jews will not replace us, or this one will not replace us. They used to say it about Italians. I mean, we had two political parties in America formed specifically against Catholics and Italians. The largest lynching in one day in American history was down in New Orleans against Sicilians. So it was never easy. And yet there were always these people, like your mom and dad, who would just keep burrowing through and making sure that we had the right values to go forward. And yeah, I think a lot of the work that you've accomplished in your life, I know for myself, is a testament to what they
Absolutely,
gave
yeah.
us. How
right.
could you ever forget that? As a matter of fact, when I was accepted at the University of Notre Dame, I wasn't necessarily thinking about going there, but I knew that it meant a lot to my father.
No, no.
And I said, how can you just pass that up? Right? The guy also fought in World War II and sacrificed like hell. And I think there's something in the nature of that kind of sacrifice and suffering that also can transform a community. Don't you, John?
Yeah, absolutely. And in my case, I also had the role models of my older brothers. I mean, they were almost a generation apart from me. I mean, I was when I was born, my brothers were teenagers, and so when I was old enough, I took care of their kids. You know, uh, and so we kind of depended on each other. But I think the nature of trying to do better to you know, to let your parents and your brothers know that you have met their expectations is a very strong motivator.
Yeah.
I'm sure that when I see the Indian and Chinese kids in our various neighborhoods who've immigrated here, their parents are expecting them to do well. And that is the nature of immigration. And that's why I think immigration is so important
Mm,
for countries. They bring fantastic ideas. They bring, entrepreneurialism, but also the strength and conviction of these families who have, been poor or not been able to do what they need to do in their countries. And they brought them here. Uh, and we should embrace that. We should be
yeah.
happy for it, not the other way around. I mean, when I
Exactly.
see what's going on the southern borders, and people are there complaining that all these people are crossing the border and they're going to do such harm. Yeah, there's some that come along and they bring the fentanyl and everything else across with them, but there's so many more of those people who are going to add to the values and sense of community in the United States and elsewhere. Um, in my book Eden 2084, um, when mass migration happens because of the 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels occurs in that particular book, there are so many people that are going to just flood across these artificial borders, basically. The borders become more borders because of heat and climate disintegration. They're just going to wind up in places, and now they're going to be there's in this book is going to need to have barriers, not because they don't want these people. It's just they can't uh, take them on because of limited resources.
Right.
And so we should embrace what we know today to be able to bring these people into our communities and encourage them to be part of who we are and what we do, but also bring their own values and cultures. And we need to be able to embrace that as well.
Yeah. John, is there ever going to be a time, in your view, when people are not going to have to leave because of climate, because of economic circumstances, because of the conditions that your family experiences? Do you ever envision a time? I mean, for us, that's the holy grail when that doesn't occur. And I'm thinking about our friends in Vietnam. Um, One of our top 7 cities for many of you out there is Binh Dong. It was the first intelligent community in Vietnam. And we've seen a phenomenon there that actually gratifies me to the extent that I could keep doing this now because of it, which is they have now people coming back to Vietnam, the talented people, right? The Lucases, the John Youngs coming back to Vietnam after spending 10, 15 years in the West, out of the country, because they see that this is their time. They look at what's happening in Bin Dong with the aid of ICF, with Eindhoven, and we're not going to certainly take the credit for it. There are a lot of people working on this. But all of a sudden, you've seen this dynamic. People going back home because the conditions now have gotten to the point where they see the future. To me, that is ideal in a way. And it will not, I don't think, prevent immigration. People are always going to go different places because they're adventurous and because they think they can bring their talents elsewhere and do better, whatever it is. But do you see that as the exception or the rule, or is it just so hard now that we're going to be experiencing those kind of climate refugees that you spoke of for the next 80 years?
Yeah, I'm always disappointed after every COP, and it just ended yesterday, COP 27 in Egypt, and the one that before that also was a disappointment. But there's always something coming out of the news saying, the environment has come back in this particular area, or the temperature expectations are now no longer as high as 4 degrees, but
Right.
now is 2.8. And that gives me hope. But when you look at what's going on in Doha, in Qatar, with the World Cup today, and you learn that tens of thousands of people who worked in extreme weather, 65 degrees Celsius. That's well over 120 Fahrenheit.
It's like working on mercury.
It's they're killers. And so if you're living and working in environments that are that hot and that deadly, well, then you are going to move. But if you're able to adapt in a climate, even though it might be high in their 40s, I think people will want to stay where they have family, where they have their culture,
Right.
where they have their history and traditions. And I think we should encourage that and try and make that happen. I think that the current COP agreement to try and support those communities in third world countries, usually in hot zones, when they have environmental issues, climate change issues, and others. I think that's the right direction to go, and I think we in the first world need to be able to make those kinds of payments happen. Now, how is it actually going to happen? I think you need to have the basics of community. You have to have the ability to enact trade, and I think with the communication systems as they've evolved and the costs have lowered, we're able to see the kinds of developments like Bin Dong going into communities that previously were seen as untenable, unable to develop their communities, to be able to trade and do things. But I think that what we're seeing in a place like Bin Dong is the future. It's a great model. I think if people haven't seen what is going on there, they should. And I've pointed out some examples like Espoo in terms of a model community of the future, but that doesn't have to be like that. There are other community examples that I look to, and some of those are in communities where people would otherwise leave, and you can see some of them now taking place in the Middle East and elsewhere, but they cost so much to make happen and to operate in that kind of heat.
Exactly.
That makes it unbearable.
We're not going to exclusively engineer our way out of this situation. Engineering is going to be a part of it because we're kind of too lazy to do anything, the right way. So we think, oh, our technology will engineer our way out of it. It's only part of the solution. And I think you're right. I was encouraged, John. There's a professor down at Texas Tech University, Catherine Hayhoe. I don't know if you've read her, seen her lately. We're trying to get her. Matt and I are trying to get her on the show here. But she's actually echoing what we've been saying for 15 years, which is that the real action on climate will have to come from the local level. It's going to be places like Fredericton, who tried to exceed Kyoto Accords way back when, all the way forward to every intelligent community that we've had this year in the Smart 21 who focused on sustainability. Evidently, national governments are just a little too dysfunctional to make this happen. So it's got to happen on the ground. In our intelligent communities, we have dozens of models now, right?
Yeah, well, the urban areas are the places where you're going to get those solutions from, because not only are they experiencing their issues, but they have the ability to coalesce, bring together all the resources necessary to be able to deal with a particular issue in their community. I think solutions coming out of urban areas are going to be the way that will help to solve the global crises around us. And but it's not just big urban areas. It's like you say, some of the smaller communities, they're looking for ways to mitigate, adapt, and in fact, clean up their communities to the point that they have a net zero environment well before some of the larger communities will be able to. Why? Because they're much more adaptable. They're agile. They're able to make a commitment. They have leadership in those communities that is able to drive things. It doesn't have to go through so many committees to
Right.
make these things happen. And having broadband in their communities, they can really solve a lot of things. It's funny. The reason I picked LaGrange for one of the books was because we got to know LaGrange early on in the early 2000s. But I always imagined, a community like that that's so well versed in how to use broadband, because they were one of the first that I ever saw figure it out. They figured out that, they have all this dark fiber in their ground. What do you do with it? And they got the local university to help train over a television channel on how to type and how to attach a file, and all those sort of early things that people had to do to gain access to it. And once they discovered, they're not just selling to people down the street, their wares or saying hello to their local friends. They were saying hello to the world and selling to the world. And this was a really early set of applications back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And so I turned it around and I thought, could they capture a killer? And in this particular story, it was the Zodiac killer.
The Zodiac killer, yeah.
That was coming after somebody that had moved to LaGrange. And, it's an interesting story about how all of the telecommunications capabilities in that community turned on the killer.
Right.
As could possibly take place, yeah.
Yeah. Who survives, right, in the end there? But we won't give that away. That's a sound in the night for those of you who want to read another one of John's books. But LaGrange was an early example, and of course, they had an international company, Callaway Golf, and they began to be more global as a result of some of the ideas that we were sharing down there as well. Speaking of best practices, John, as we start to wrap it up, we've always taken ideas like sustainability and all of the ideas that are percolating through many cities and just shared them across the platform of 200 cities. In October, we got a chance to have our summit finally live in that city that I think for many of us represents the art of the possible for a city of 50, 60,000 people in the middle of the American heartland in Ohio. That would be Dublin, Ohio, which we talk a lot about, and people probably say, Jesus, these guys, I mean, well, they're drunk on Dublin. Well, you know, the beer's pretty good out there, so's the bourbon, but we're not drunk on them. They're actually doing it. And I just want to have you sort of give us your take on what you saw when you got on the ground in Dublin, Ohio this year in terms of urban planning, the ideas of the new urbanism, and why that city may very well be the one that other cities of that size need to look to over the next 40 or 50 years.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And in fact, I spoke with the former city manager about this. When I went to visit Dublin, over a decade ago, he took me around, and I saw some old field and shopping center that was dilapidated, and he talked about sort of the creation of a new city on this side of the river. So it's separate. The town of Dublin is actually two sides of a river, and the one side is the old traditional town. It has some new things, a wonderful city library, but a couple of pubs, beautiful little Main Street and residential areas and so forth. It also has a lot of Fortune 500 companies that are located in and around that area. And that's because that city manager, Dana McDaniel, he created this thing called Dublink, which brought a lot of high-speed broadband into that area. And of course, companies joined in and so forth. And that brought wealth to the community, and people wanted to be part of that community. So they developed on that other side of the river that I had seen, the sort of open field and parking lot and old shopping center. And it was done as a comprehensive community development. It's still under construction, but we stayed there. The hotels were on that side. I spent a lot of time walking around, and it has all of the elements that you want in a community. It has residential, it has entertainment, restaurants, educational facilities, startups, offices, markets, etc., and an iconic bridge that brings in the old history of the traditional town into the new town. And that iconic
a walking bridge, right?
It's a pedestrian bridge. There are other
Yeah.
bridges on either side that move vehicles, but in the middle is this pedestrian bridge. And it sort of is designed to look like it's threading the needle. And it's connecting that sense of the past to the future. And every time I walked across that bridge, and people, at nighttime could really see that threading idea. The community, it's not that large,
No.
but it really felt complete.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
Right? I mean, for me as an urban planner, I could see how that economic development force, coupled with the communications that it was built on, this doubling. In fact, the bridge is called the doubling.
I was just thinking that. Yeah. And how many, it's probably the only bridge on Earth that was named after a fiber optic network that transformed a city, right? I just wrote that in my new blog.
Absolutely.
Who would name their bridge? I mean, they get it so much that they name their bridge after the new infrastructure.
And so it shows that, if you have the right ingredients and you have a really, decent plan. I mean, they had a really good plan that kind of brought this community together. People would have to see the design, and you'd have to see pictures of it. But what Lou and I are feeling here is a sense that, this optimism of how one can create a model community exists. Dublin, Eindhoven, Espoo, these are all communities that we are honored to be able to visit and talk about and tell stories about, that people out there should look at closely when they're doing plans for their communities and building a resilient and sustainable plan for the future. Thanks for bringing that up, Lou. It's a great story. Dublin's a great story.
Well, I was picking up on your vibe out there because you got really excited as we were walking around, as you do in a lot of cities. But I mean, you really were enthusiastic about Dublin. And as usual, you were always pointing things out to me. You see how this is laid out. You feel like you're in the middle of a big city and this and this. And, I'm looking for a cup of espresso and you're telling me how these places are laid out. And it's, thank God, I'm so grateful for you, John. Well, listen, congratulations on these books. They are terrific. I mean, BlackRock really brought me home. So I appreciate that you wrote that. And you haven't signed my copy yet, though.
No, I'll do that one day when we're together.
I was, I was just saying, I had
yeah.
a couple of ICF jurors. I was telling Matt offline for dinner over at my place last night, and I was showing them the book, and they were flipping through it, and they asked me, after reading it, did you think of John differently? Did you feel like you had more of an insight into him? Well, I said, yeah, I feel like, I always knew him, but it reaffirmed everything that I thought and more about him. So I just wanted to put that out there to you.
It was fiction, though.
That's right. You're really not that nice, are you? Hey, no, it was a great book. Listen, John, thanks. We'll talk about your other books through the year as well, because we should probably do this again. But thanks for making the time, because I know we got a lot going on right now.
Thanks a lot for pushing this book. I think it's actually the last book that got published. There are all these other books, and the one that I'm working on right now is totally different. So I'm hoping, and this last one's taking a lot longer. The other one's kind of just poof, they all came out.
Flowed right out, yeah.
This one's taking a lot longer. I don't know what it's not that I have any kind of mental hang up. It's just I've got to make this right. I've got to really get the research into it and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a different process. So thanks for taking me on this. It's a wonderful opportunity to promote it.
Yeah, well, we'll do it again. And as you say, that new book takes you back to Germany. So it's about the Berlin Wall, I believe. So we're looking forward to that one. Well, that concludes my conversation with John Jung. You can find BlackRock and his other books at Amazon.com. And you can stay in touch with him and the Intelligent Community Forum and learn about our method for helping cities thrive by following us on Facebook and Twitter at New Communities. And subscribe and get a new podcast every 2 weeks at intelligentcommunity.org. By the way, the ICF 2023 Summit, where you can meet cities like LaGrange and Bindong and Dublin, Ohio, is scheduled for New York on October 25th and 26th, 2023. Matt, I hope I got that right. We hope to see you there. New nomination forms for ICF's Intelligent Community of the Year, which gets named in New York at that time, is now available. This is a new nomination form. It's been streamlined. So many communities who found the other one a little onerous, I think will find this a little bit easier to complete and to send data to us through. You can find out more about that and complete it at our website at intelligentcommunity.org/questionnaire. And we really do encourage you to take that self-test to see where your community stands against all the others that have been designated as intelligent. Remember, ICF is the process of self-improvement for cities and for the places that you call home and the places you want your children to continue to call home for generations to come. Hey, listen, for the Intelligent Community Podcast and our producer, Matt Owen, my colleague, John Young, I'm Lou Zacharilla, reminding you there really is no place like home. Take care, everybody.